In the last module, we talked about how concepts serve two important roles that are fundamental to cognition. On the one hand, we said that concepts facilitate categorization, the grouping of diverse, complex, highly variable experiences into types, helping us to organize our perception and our thought. In addition to that, concepts facilitate the encoding, the organization, and the retrieval of knowledge for the purposes of problem solving and decision making. We then turn to three features of concepts that facilitate these roles. The first feature that we looked at was this notion of cognitive economy, this idea that concepts provide us with a general classification of objects, of properties, events, or relations. And this facilitates access to a manageable amount of highly relevant information for interacting with objects of that type. So cognitive economy is this happy medium between too much information and too little information. It is this goal of accessing only relevant, useful information and not accessing irrelevant or useless information. The next feature that we want to look at here is the idea that concepts facilitate the encoding of knowledge, the organization of knowledge, and the retrieval of knowledge. To illustrate this, just think about the following question. Suppose I ask you if you've read the first book to sell 1 million copies in the United States. Under that description, that way of conceptualizing the question, you may not have any idea whether or not you have. However, if I were to ask you if you've read Uncle Tom's Cabin, which ironically was the first book to sell 1 million copies in the United States, if I asked you if you've read that book, then you can answer the question fairly quickly and easily because of the way it has been categorized, conceptualized. Similarly, if I tell you that I have a dog, you can easily infer that I own an animal, since your concepts are organized to facilitate seeing relationships between different concepts. So when concepts operate to facilitate encoding of knowledge, organization of knowledge, and retrieval of knowledge, they facilitate inferences and decision making in a quick and efficient fashion. They allow us to make appropriate and even optimal adaptive responses to our situations. When they don't facilitate this encoding, organization, or retrieval, then we have the situation that we saw with the first question I asked. Have you read the first book to sell 1 million copies in the United States? That way of conceptualizing things doesn't allow you access to that information, doesn't allow you to see the relationships between that information and other ways, other aspects of the world, and therefore you can't retrieve the knowledge even if you have it. One way to think about this combination of categorization and encoding, organization, and retrieval of knowledge is through what I call the semi-symmetrical cone of conceptualization. So when you think about our everyday cognition, we are being bombarded by our senses with a superabundance of information, just an overwhelming amount of information, so much information that we don't have the resources, the time, the memory, and we don't have the processing abilities to actually use all the information that's coming into us through our senses. And so when we get all that input, what our brain does, what categorization and conceptualization does, is it allows us to take all that information and kind of distill it down, discarding a bunch of it through this process of categorization so that we get a hold of a few bits of information that are manageable and useful in our interactions with the environment. So once we categorize these objects, now we have access to this short-term information, this wellspring of manageable, highly relevant information that has proved useful in our interactions with objects of that type in the past. And then if we need more information, if we want to access information that isn't typically immediately useful for interacting with objects of that type, we can then go to our long-term memory and access information that is less often useful, anecdotal information, experiences, facts that don't often have relevance to solving problems or making decisions. And so we can see how these two things work together in problem solving and decision making. We jettison, distill the tremendous amount of information that we get from our experiences, from our senses. And that is a good trade-off for us because there's all this variability and complexity in that information. It's just overwhelming for us. And so if we discard it, we get down to a more manageable way of dealing with the information that's coming in. And if we need to go back and get that information, then we can go back and use our senses. We can use the world, in effect, as a memory. And so when I look out at a visual scene and I see a cup, I jettison a whole bunch of information about that cup once I categorize it. That is, I introduce this useful transcontextual category. In doing so, I stop thinking about the cup in terms of a lot of its features and particularities. So I don't think about it so much in terms of its color or the subtle permutations of the color, or even particularly where exactly it is on the table at that moment. I don't think about all of my past experiences with it. I just focus in on this way of thinking about the cup as a kind of thing. And this allows me to access a set of information that in the past, in my experiences, has proven highly useful and that is manageable for the purposes of problem solving and decision making. If I need more information, if I need information that isn't part of that, but is part of my knowledge base, then with greater time, I can go and find that knowledge. I have a greater depth of knowledge about those things that I can access through that initial categorization as well. Finally, concepts license inductive inferences and learning, particularly inferences that go beyond immediate perceived experience. And this is how concepts facilitate our learning as well. We take all the experiences that we group together under our concepts, and we're now able to think about these objects and learn about these objects in ways that go beyond our particular moment and our particular place. We can now draw information from our past. We can draw information from other spatially distanced experiences that we've had, and we can use all that information to make inductive inferences, or for that matter, to make decisions. So concepts allow us to bring our past experience to our present concerns. Events are never exactly the same from one case to the next. There may be important aspects of various events, however, that recur. And it's useful to be able to treat them as the same kind of event, the same kind of object, or property, or relationship, so that we can take advantage of those deeper similarities, despite the more superficial differences that the variability and complexity of immediate experience presents them in. In order to make those inferences, we have to come up with categories, concepts, ways of breaking up the world and our experiences that actually facilitate those kinds of inferences, such that our learning really does get at underlying structural similarities across contexts. And we can succeed in doing this, but we can also fail at doing this. And when we fail at doing this, we do things like what the phrenologist Franz Gall did. Franz Gall examined a whole bunch of skulls, looked at them in all sorts of detail. He was convinced that the surface of the skull could give you insight into the operations of the mind that contained it. This turned out to be a terrible categorization scheme for making inferences about psychological processes. And so he had an elaborate experience-based categorization scheme, but it failed to appropriately categorize the world such that the regularities that he thought he was observing were useful for making good inferences or decisions in circumstances that he encountered.